So this is it. This is official. My podcast has now gone international thanks to my good friend and brother Yochai. Welcome.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yochai, you are my first international guest because you are in Israel. And I am here in Denver, and thanks to the miracle of technology, we get to have our first podcast together.
Guilty as charged. I'm in the central region of Israel in Renana, and I'm looking forward to interacting live in Denver.
So there's a saying I think it's Pirkei Avot, Aseh lecha rav v'kaneh lecha chaver. Make for yourself a teacher and acquire a friend. And I'm not 100% sure what that means, but I just know when I met you, I got both.
Flattery will get you everywhere. And the corollary of that, right, is Dan kol adam b'kav zchut, which means that if you view me as both, you have to view me favorably. So,
Well, I don't know if I don't have to view you favorably. You've been viewing me favorably for 10, 15 years. I met Yochai for our guests here when I was living in Israel back in 2015 or 16 or somewhere in there. And I was going through some pretty intense times, needed, therapists and coaches and rabbis need a therapist, coach, and rabbi. And that's when I somehow stumbled upon Yochai. And ever since then, you have been all three of those things for me, in addition to being a friend. So I really want to hit on many things today, not the least of which is how you guided me through the dark woods. I'd like to try and do that for other people, but you've been that for me. So thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm a little bit floored by all of the credits that you're attributing to me. I would hasten to add that it's a bit of a booby trap to think that I did anything other than maybe just help catalyze your own organic process toward growth and getting to where you are right now. But I'll take it. So thanks, and I'm happy to discourse around it.
One of the things that you've provided me in my life over the past 15 years, I guess, I can't remember, I'm just 10, 15 years, is, we all need a witness. I've really come to appreciate in the second half of my life the importance of having a witness, somebody to bear witness to your journey, to see you, to sort of, what's that old saying, if tree falls in the woods and nobody's there to hear it kind of thing, did it actually happen? And we need those people in our lives. I imagine I'm not the first and only person to say that, but you really are a good witness. Maybe, I don't know, I'd love to hear your take on that, just that concept and the role you play in people's lives.
Yeah, well, I think, if we're going to go with that definition, I think to be a good witness, it requires being an active and participative audience member. And being a participative audience member requires a critical read. You have to engage with the person, with the text. And usually that means trying to focus, trying to stay curious, not having too much of a difficult time remembering details.
Mm-hmm.
And because, I think that you have a general level of charisma, which added to the size of challenge that you were facing, made it quite easy for me to witness. That's maybe a backhanded compliment. It's not the intention. But I think that it's a muscle that you train, and you need to remember that it's a privilege. There's a sacred intimacy, and when you bear that in mind, it becomes a lot easier to be that witness. So and I like that definition.
Yes, and knowing you are a humble person by nature. And so I just want to kind of challenge maybe a little bit. I'm not a humble person by nature. I think we chose our profession. I chose my original profession, rabbi, I think for that reason. I don't think most rabbis would admit this, but they like to hear themselves talk. They want the stage, and you're training for the stage, the bima, the stage. And in that process, over 20 years of training and doing it, I became the sage on the stage. right? And shifting into the role of therapist and now coach, you really do have to be a better listener than a talker. And it's been hard, it's been challenging for me to learn that skill. And so part of our work together has been for just me to learn something that I think comes so much more organically or naturally to you, which is listening. I imagine that's been true your whole life. Does that make sense? Is that fair?
Well, I think no, because I was as a younger person, as a teenager, and even beyond that, I didn't imagine that I would grow into being a psychologist. I had a vague notion of myself as a healer, but I think it was quite a narcissistic, it was almost like imagining oneself to be some kind of neurosurgeon or some celebrity healer. And what I think helped me was just a very, very deep interest and passion for the human drama, which is writ large when you're in therapy. It becomes a very three-dimensional two-hander and is easy to engage with. But I also think that it's often, I don't want to say cowardly, but it's non-confrontational to work as a therapist. Um, I think that for you, there's a rewiring that goes on when you want to step into the shoes of the listener, because there's a brash, risk-taking quality that you have. We speak about this often, the kind of the visionary element that is a part of you, which involves a willful exposure to conflict. So, as I say, I wouldn't call myself cowardly, but I would call myself careful, more conservative, less prone to risk and its fallout. So I would quietly envy your ability to take the risks that you do and hope that you would get the rewards that you anticipating, and just be thankful it's not me when I see you don't get there, because I don't know that I would deal as well with fallout as what you do.
There's an old, I don't know if it's a Misa, it's a true story or not, but it's true whether or not it happened. The Senator Bill Bradley, I think he was New Jersey, former basketball player, was big shot and was at a restaurant and asked the waiter, can I get another pat of butter? And the waiter says to him, one pat of butter per customer. And he says, do you know who I am? I am Senator Bill Bradley. I have played professional basketball. I'm on the arms committee. I'm blah, 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 blah. And the waiter listens to him and finally says to him, do you know who I am? And Bradley says, no. He says, I'm the waiter. I'm the guy with the butter. You get one pat. It's that behind the scenes power, right? Like we all play our part. And I don't know if you can have two Senator Bill Bradleys together, and I don't know if you can have two Baruch HaLevis together. And I feel like you've played a part of a supporting, best supporting actor in my life.
No.
And that allows me in some way. And Ariella does the same thing, and I do the same thing for her. But my best friend, as you know, Mark, died 6 years ago at this point, and he was a very similar personality to you. And I just wonder, like in life, do we attract to us the yang, the yin to our yang? And I do feel like you came into my life in some ways for that reason, because it allows me to be a little bit braver. I think take a little more risk to have you playing that part.
Well, to that end, it's definitely worth remarking that I've noticed, by intention, by design, a real willingness into vulnerability over this last period. It's been a while since we spoke. There were these organic breaks because of war and whatnot, COVID, I guess, but on our resumption, I felt that there was a real transformation in your intent and the design of how you wanted to go about expressing in the world, which is, as I say, is a willful vulnerability. And again, I don't think that it comes naturally to you. to enter into that more exposed place. But I think that you understand the utility, the real benefits that attach to that, even if in the short term it feels quite scary, unappealing.
Yeah, that's something you've certainly helped me with is I think in terms of macro, right? Big picture, big movements, big decisions. And I think in some ways that's an escape of vulnerability. Because if I'm taking those big swings for the fence, right? I don't know. I'm not really showing much of my, of my true self or of the quiet, the day-to-day stuff. And one of the things you've helped me with is really to look at the micro, look at my relationships, slow it down, look at the people around me. And that is partially why I think I've been able to be more vulnerable or get into vulnerability in a way I couldn't when I was only talking or thinking in terms of macro. Does that make sense?
Yes. Um, I think, one of the great blind spots that being macro affords is one is so dazzled by the opportunity or by the fantasy of greatness that you don't focus on the details. It's like out of my way while I try to rule the world. I don't have time for the minutia. And they say the devil's in the details, but I think life is in the details. Life is in the intimate appreciation, the subtleties of moments, and it takes courage to look at the little moments just as much as it does the big ones. So, if that makes sense.
It does. And, people probably have sensed that your accent maybe is like a South Tel Aviv kind of an accent or a, Northern Israel kind of accent. They would be wrong because, truth be told, your origin story began in South Africa. And I say that because when you're talking, I was thinking of Nelson Mandela and a lot of leaders like Mandela who they make these macro contributions to the world. Like nobody made a more macro one maybe than Mandela. But then you hear about the micro of his life falling apart. It's just kind of a like you hear about like Julian Lennon and John Lennon, Julian's son, and John was a macro person whose micro didn't get attended to necessarily. And I don't know. I think it's a common story of men who pay too much attention to the macro. They lose the micro, they lose that vulnerability, and they pay a price for it.
So right. So just for the record, I was actually born in Israel and raised in South Africa. And our most recent dog, was actually named for Mandela. Um, so certainly in my wife's life, he played quite an iconic role. I think that his ultimate visionary remark that he's credited with is everything is impossible until it's done. And you're right. I think he definitely stopped to smell the roses as he got older and was, his biggest claim to fame was how much he loved hanging out with little children. But there were many casualties, people that fell on the sacrificial pyre of his advancement, children, grandchildren, marriages, etc. And other than the fact that he saved humanity, he was often depicted as an unsympathetic character.
Hmm.
And so our tradition, the Jewish tradition, holds by different measures, right? So like, for example, there's nothing mediocre in Judaism about being a great dad or being a family man, any of those things. You could just be a 9 to 5er as long as you nurture and faithfully transmit values. I think that I hope that somebody like Mandela managed to do that as well, but I don't think it was his priority.
Well, I mean, it's also a bit of privilege, I guess, is to use a modern kind of idea, that it's a lot more possible to focus on your family when your nation, right, is at rest, when there's peace, when there's comfort, and I guess that's a segue maybe into Israel, because I see the same thing in Israel. It's a country that's, so focused on existential issues that sometimes, and one of the reasons why I left, that sometimes it feels like the family dynamic is a little strained, stressed, intense, overwhelming, sometimes falling apart. Because I imagine, and you're Israeli, far more Israeli than I am. I imagine again, it's like what happens when you're so focused on the macro that the micro gets glossed over a bit.
Yeah, I would defy any country to come even close to Israel in terms of the daily news cycle. It's just unbelievable for such a small piece of land and such a small amount of people to generate such an incredible amount of drama and conflict and achievement and failure and everything that is comprised of comedy, history, tragedy, all kind of rolled into one. And so it's to live in Israel is to live, I think, a meaning oversaturated existence. That is impossible really to relate to um, until you've lived here. So I spent a lot of the first part of my life as a diaspora Jew, and just you have a Sunday, you have a proper weekend, you have an 8 to 5 reality, and not that much happens. And then to come here, somebody said something. Actually, the chief rabbi of the Commonwealth said that Israel is one of the world's smallest nations, but it's the world's largest family. And so if you imagine, a Friday night dinner or a Thanksgiving dinner, that's basically what's going on here 24/7. And so it's staggering. And everybody has an opinion and also a right to an opinion. The traditional hierarchies are thrown away. Teachers are addressed by their first names. All shows of pomp and pageantry are literally ignored. So, and these are all outcomes of this very familial, over comfortable feeling with each other, for better or for worse.
Yeah, even like prime ministers are not even just names, but nicknames. Bibi, like, nobody calls Donald
Right.
Donnie, right? Uh,
Exactly.
so, and there's all kinds of great literature on why that's created the startup nation and, 1,000 other positive ramifications, but also um, a strain and a stress, right? Thanksgiving is a complicated holiday here in America where, we're preparing for it and you start thinking about the family dynamics and it's you're alive, it's intense. And you said that's actually a good way to think about Israel. It's meaning saturated. It's also macro
Meaning
saturated,
oversaturated. Yeah.
oversaturated, but it's also macro saturated. Like when I lived there, I was always thinking macro, right? In terms of the world and impact and existential. And then you come back to America, and for a while at least, it's refreshing to go to the numbing suburbs where it's quiet and subdued and predictable. And both have their positives, both have their negatives.
Correct. Right. And that's that kind of Zen principle where nothing is given without something being taken away. There's no gaining of experience without loss of innocence. There's no appreciation of beauty without exposure to what's not beautiful. And fragility. So so that's what it is. To live here is to reimagine precariousness, I
Hmm.
think, on both a macro and a micro level. And the bulwark against that is this security, this closeness that derives from calling the prime minister by a nickname. That there's and it's an impenetrable understanding, but once you're in it, I think it's very difficult to imagine a life without it.
So maybe that's a segue into, the nature of this podcast is I talk with just great men who are living out their purpose, their why. It's called 13 minutes based on the tragic American statistic, although I think it's true throughout most of the world. I don't think it's true exactly in Israel, and that's every 13 minutes a man kills himself here in America. And part of that is also veterans. 22 veterans a day in America kill themselves, basically one an hour. And if you do that proportionally, it's higher than the actual statistic of 13 minutes. But the bottom line is, it doesn't matter what the number is, it's a tragedy, no matter how you slice it. And so this podcast is called Why Every Man Needs a Why, based on Viktor Frankl's notion or philosophy that if quoting Nietzsche, those who have a why can endure anyhow. And so in my experience, having been a survivor of loss to suicide 2 generations and counseling lots of people who have attempted or gone, or family members who have experienced it. When you have a why, you have what you need to live and you can endure the hows. And that's a long way of winding up to get into Israel because, at least from my cursory understanding, Israel doesn't have nearly the suicide epidemic numbers as America, whether the general population, the male population, and by the way, 80% of suicides in America are men, so it's disproportionately a male epidemic, or the veteran community, especially in Israel. I was told that it's a rarity, it's the exception, not the norm, to hear about a veteran or active duty suicide in the military. And I've heard a lot of different reasons why that is, but I don't know. I'd love to hear your take on this idea of suicide statistics, America versus Israel, or Israel versus the rest of the world, and maybe even dispelling some of that if it's not true.
Okay, so it's a fascinating and infinite subject, and it's difficult to know what the statistics are for lots of reasons, because since the war, there are some people who contend that the suicide rate has stayed pretty much consistent. That would be very hard to believe because the level of trauma and stress has gone through the roof, and the way this war kicked off, there were a tremendous amount of civilians who, more than at any other point in Israel's history, who were directly or one degree of separation affected. And within about 5 or 6 days of the war beginning, so I was working with what do you call it, Mifunim, with refugees from cities that were directly in the line of fire. And there was just an unbelievable mass of trauma, especially in children whom I work with. We believe that children are very robust and resilient and adaptable, which they are. And you could see that the way these kids were trying to process the trauma was not effective because it wasn't really post-trauma. Maybe now, which is only about a week ago, that there's a ceasefire, and even that, we couldn't really talk about it as post-trauma. It was just chronic, ongoing trauma. And so my guess, although it's entirely anecdotal, is I would be very surprised if there wasn't some increase in suicidality. I don't know that it would be that significant because what Israel has is a number of bulwarks against that kind of escalation. There are a lot of counterintuitive paradoxes for me that relate to suicide, which is it's usually the late capitalist countries, like places like Sweden and Australia and Norway, which, these countries are in the clear in terms of socioeconomic viability for the citizens. And yet this is where the statistics are alarming. Israel consistently scores in the top 10, sometimes in the top 5, overall happiness indices. And I think, if we take as a general model the way suicide works is it goes stress, despair, suicidal ideation, action, right? As a general, and then stress breaks down into psychological distress that each person has as a result of their worldview, their personality, etc., etc. Trauma, which for sure has been very prevalent, both in terms of the war, but also the betrayal, right? There's tremendous social media prejudice against Israel citizens and being exposed, as I say, for 2 years to constant. I know that when my son was in service in Gaza and also on the Lebanese border, that every morning for close to 3 months, my wife and I would wake up with bated breath, waiting. We would read the published list of names of soldiers. And it was a fiction because the army would always contact a bereaved family beforehand. But because we'd read the names of many community members in that fashion, children of community members, we were both absolutely terrified. Just to carry on about trauma, I was talking to a 12-year-old earlier this week who was saying that he doesn't believe that it's normal that he spent his entire summer waking up 3 or 4 times a week at 3 a.m. to sirens followed by these massive explosions, almost like, I suppose, the Blitz was in World War II for the Allies that were being bombed, or the Brits that were being bombed by the Germans. So, but I think that, and the third part of stress is what's called isolation, right? So the social isolation piece, which this media campaign, I think, has been hugely effective at achieving in the world, of isolating Israel, of forcing Jews and Israelis to circle the wagons, plus the trauma, plus the general malaise of psychological stress. All of that can lead to, just to complete the model, can lead to despair, right? Despair is like a terrible, terrible place to visit because it's a slippery slope. And there was the father of cognitive behavioral psychology, a guy called Aaron Beck, right? So Aaron Beck used a heuristic which was a better predictor of suicidality even than depression, which is just one feature of it, which is hopelessness. So when you have a sense of hopelessness, like that Dante-esque thing of ye who enter here abandon all hope. That's kind of the definition of the inferno of hell. So when you have hopelessness, when you're made to believe that they're never going to stop persecuting you, victimizing you, hating you, coming at you, so there's no way out, right? There's no way out, and then you experience a failure of imagination, a failure of ability to solve this problem. So what happens is you disconnect first from the wider group, you circle the wagons, and then if you're very unlucky, you disconnect from all the people around you. And so if you have, because of the psychological stress you're exposed to, you get into this place of despair. Staying in that space of despair for too long is what leads to the suicidal ideation. And what is the suicidal ideation? Is when you brood, you think about ways that I could end this, how I'm going to do it. Also, the other thing, if there were an increase in suicide in Israel, is there's one of the predictors of suicidality is what's called interpersonal exposure. So if you're somebody who's exposed over and over again to trauma or violence or death, so what happens is our natural fear of death is diluted, right? You become desensitized. And when you're full of despair and desensitized to that gap between living and dying, it feels like slipping a suit, shedding a skin, I would imagine, which is, part of the impaired problem solving, part of the lack of imagination. And you, when you don't have the imagination, so you have this cognitive rigidity. I'm sorry, I know that I'm going on and on, but all of that. So what happens in Israel is there's been, it's meaning oversaturated. but you have your why. You're armed with your why. You understand that that you're the line, right? You're whoever you are in Israel. If you're the mom who's baking cakes for soldiers, if you're the politician, if you're the soldier, if you're the guy who's sitting in intelligence, whoever you might be in the society, you understand that the buck stops with you. And everybody, it's like a congregation, everybody feels like they need to step up. So the meaning piece there, it's very difficult to go away because, and then why do you feel like your life is so meaningful? Is because there's an unbelievable level when push comes to shove of support. So, for war veterans, I think the number one predictor of suicide is perceived lack of support. Nobody gives a shit. Nobody remembers your contribution. Nobody respects you. Nobody gives you the credit that you're so fully entitled to for allowing their lives to continue unimpeded. It's like this thank you for your service. So here, everywhere, you're reminded there are stickers everywhere and flags and funerals and talk shows, etc., etc. So it's much harder to feel socially isolated. And then the third thing is that part of the package of being Jewish, being Israeli, is you're inured to. It's not going to get any easier. People dream that the next generation is not going to have to fight. That we're going to take off our uniforms and we're going to sniff flowers together. But nobody is naive enough to believe, even right now, right, post ceasefire, already everybody's back in this country anyway into this kind of cynical, watchful, vigilant mode. Even as people are obeying the protocols, I don't think anybody properly believes that we're in the clear, and there's this new version of the Middle East. But being inured to that persecution is also amazingly a protection against the surprise of the isolation. So, anyway, I'm going to stop
Good
speaking.
stuff. No, there's so much there. So a couple things. One is there's that old story about back in the days of the kibbutz when they were all kind of waiting for telephone lines, and it was like a 5-year wait or something. And the guy from Bezek, the national operator, was making his way through the kibbutz, and somebody says, "Is it really going to take 5 years?" The guy says, "It's going to take 5 years." The kibbutznik says, "Is there any hope that it'll take less than 5 years?" The guy said, "Of course there's hope. There's always hope. It's not going to happen." Right. And that to me is like that paradox of, the national anthem of Israel is called the hope. And
Right.
so we hold that on the one extreme. And on the other hand, we hold that cynical, as the Arabs say, have faith in God and tie up your camels. Right. And that's how you create that resilience of, yes, we don't give up on hope. And we also hold the reality, not the ideal what we want, but the reality, and we prepare for it. And that's a resilience that I think is a bulwark against suicide or despair.
Totally. And, the other thing about when you get to a place where you're suicidal is you're trapped, right? It's like that thing where you're in a room and you're on the 10th floor, right? So there's no way down, and the building is burning. So if you open the door, the backdraft will incinerate you, but you can't go out the window and you can't stay in the room and get asphyxiated. So, but Israelis and Jews typically are genius at thinking outside the box, even if it's like Houdini-esque, right? So the easiest thing would be to go and sit on the ledge. So I think that's a good exemplar of therapy. It's a ledge where you can sit with somebody and dangle your feet without being terrified until the fire department or either clears the building so you can walk back in or puts a landing pad down at the bottom. And I think that that's how it is to live on the ledge in Israel, to like sit on a precipice dangling your feet. But that's what they do. People stay there and they're hopeful.
And I want to talk about, the reality that suicide is still part of Israel, just like it is in life. But before we do that, some more of the bulwarks, because now that we're talking this through, I really feel like, if we can export some of this lived experience from Israel and bring it to people's lives, and it can save lives, right? What are some of the ingredients that has made Israel unique in defying some of these statistics? So we talked about resilience. That's a piece of it. That hope, resilience, tension. Another one is back to BB, is back to nicknames, is back to first names, is back to a flattened pyramid. If you want more on this, read Startup Nation, why there's so many startups in Israel. It's the world's flattest army. From the generals to the foot soldiers, there's less proportion than anywhere else in the world. And even the generals are challenged in a way that in America would just be unheard of because of that agency. Israelis all believe they're the prime minister. They all believe they are the front lines between the enemy, between annihilation and their people. So whether it's the mother baking cakes or the soldier in Gaza and everybody in between, and that takes that gives you agency. And I see that with Israelis. Israelis have agency, personal accountability or responsibility. And I would say Viktor Frankl would say that is one of the, if not the most important bulwarks against suicide, is feeling like you have personal agency.
Completely. You know that it's if you have personal agency, you get to feel overwhelmed, but you don't get to feel so we were talking about the kind of the flattened pyramid, right? And the idea of agency, how important that is. I think that there's also, we spoke about at the beginning about leaning into vulnerability. So Israeli culture is actually it's interesting. It's a very macho culture. An Israeli man is like, a giver, like a man's man. But also people speak very dugri, very, very levelly with each other. So no matter how intimidating you might be or I might be, you're not going to back down from saying what's on your mind. And what's also really interesting is you've actually pointed this out to me, is that if in a lot of different places, if you look at somebody wrong, it leads to an inevitable escalation, which will result in some kind of overstepping a boundary of violence or offense. Whereas in Israel, people can raise their voices toward each other in very threatening overtones, and often that's just where it ends. And I think a big reason for that is because when your struggle is existential, you have a very keen sense of the difference between what a traffic argument is and what a terrorist attack is. So everybody is automated into that perspective. It's much harder to lose sight of what's going on when you live with your back against the wall. I think, just other things I would say is that there's a real tradition in Jewish thinking of problem solving. The glory, the glory of the Jewish mind is to pose a really elegant, difficult question that would inspire a more elegant, difficult solution. And so I think that, when it comes to suicidality, one is obviously overwhelmed and walloped by the size of the challenge, but one also has some, I don't know what it would be, like a tradition or a tribal faith in one's ability to rise to that challenge because it's all the way through.
So there's a story back in the 1800s, they were shipping tuna from New England to England or somewhere across the Atlantic, and the tuna were arriving dead. They were in they were in water aquariums, but they were just arriving dead or unhealthy. They tried everything, and finally they started introducing sharks into the aquarium. And when the tuna arrived, they were strong, right? They were vibrant. That tension is a necessary element. I call it introducing, the shark to the tank. When people are bored, right? That's when you see it in America on college campuses. That's why it's the bastion of nihilism, of meaninglessness, as we say in Hebrew, shtuyot, of just stupid, bored stuff that's just emanating from these places. And it comes from a place of ennui, of comfort, of boredom. That I do think that's why you have such a spike in suicide in the most comfortable places, right? You're talking about the Netherlands and other places that don't have the tensions as in Israel. And like you said, Israel's ranked consistently by the OECD as a top 10 place to live for happiness. It's counterintuitive, but it's because there's so many sharks in the tank, right? Now, I'd like to talk about after we address this issue, is that the only way to get there, that we have to live with sharks in our tank? Because that causes some, other issues that aren't so pleasant. But I do think that's a part of the secret sauce of Israel and why it's defied some of these statistics. What are your thoughts?
Well, if you think about some of the legendary initiatives, military initiatives, even as recently as the famous beeper attack, pager attack, right? So yeah, so we're surrounded by sharks, and we're not going to get eaten, right? So you got stamina filled. So there's there's a theory of suicidality called the cognitive triad, right? And what that is it's very basic. You have a persistently negative view of yourself, a persistently negative view of the world, and um, a notion that things will never change, right? So it's like, I'm not worth very much. I suck. The world is unfair. The world sucks, and things will never get better, right? So it's very, very seldom for Israelis to feel like they're worthless. In fact, by definition, an Israeli's reach exceeds his grasp. He'll always tell you he's way more capable than, you know, anyone could ever imagine anyone being capable of. They
That's
just,
that's why they're the only people in America at the mall to take the jobs at those kiosks, right?
right.
Because they just believe they can sell this shit.
Right. It makes no difference, right? If the product is terrible or good, right? They just sell it. And then this idea that the world sucks and life is unfair. Well, who ever believed there was any difference? So, when you grow up in the kind of neighborhood that you have, subject to millennia of persecution, and then as you say, things are not going to get better, but there's the hope, right? There's Hatikva. So you arm yourself with a hypothetical, and you refuse to kowtow to the idea that, I suck and life sucks. And so if you can gird yourself with that, and feel supported, feel meaning saturated and supported, on a micro and on a macro existential level. So those are probably the ingredients that go into the secret sauce. But again, I'm saying this on shaky ground because I know, I'm convinced that since the 7th of October, even though statistics are hard to come by, that there's been very, very real dark times for people here, and people have succumbed.
Yeah. So just kind of recapping some of the key ideas that I do believe, and maybe this is worth us co-venturing writing a book together. I think it could be, because we export the startup nation, entrepreneurism, and all these other things and technologies. But like, what about the secret sauce of staying alive, of choosing life, right? Jewish mission and mantra. And I think that'd be a really cool book for us to write. So note to self. Um, and so resilience, certainly, and knowing your why. I was told that a war in Israel has never been fought where somebody in the battalion hasn't been able to see their home, their village. They know what
Wow.
they're fighting for. You think about like Afghanistan, you think about Iraq, you think about Vietnam. As Americans, I don't say of course, but there's and what percentage of Americans actually serve in the military? I think it's 1, maybe 2%. So there's such a disconnect between what we're fighting for, who the war fighters are, and then when they return back to home. If you ever watched the movie American Sniper, Did you ever see the movie? He
I
comes
think so.
home.
Yeah, yeah,
Kevin Kyle, I think his name is. He comes home and he's just like so disconnected. He goes to the grocery store and there's like he can't make a decision. There's like 75 types of cereal to choose from. And he's just sitting there overwhelmed and like the world just has gone on without him. And in Israel, that's not the case. So you know your why, you know what you're fighting for, you're supported, right? It's very hard to fall through the cracks in Israeli society because you have a small group. You have your IDF chevra, your brothers and sisters. You have the Sabbath where you're checking in. There's so many. It's such a smaller place, so there's support, there's resilience, there's a why. All of that is true, and I want to like explore that, unpack that, export that. Yes, and I do believe the machismo. I do believe the survival is part of the problem too. Because one of the things I love about being in America and about starting men's peer groups here is that it's so much easier to do this here than it is in Israel because people are willing to say we're broken, we're hurting, we're traumatized, we have generational traumas. And Israelis are loath, they're reluctant to have this conversation. I think rightly so sometimes because they're in survival mode. But the human being isn't built to live in survival mode. Right? It has consequences mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually to live perennially in a state of fight or flight. And so I think that the time has come for Israelis to start embracing some of the gifts of the diaspora and bringing in this mental health and wellness, and especially for men, men's peer groups, opening, vulnerability, softness, sharing, healing. Love to hear your thoughts on that because I know Israel is a superpower in many ways in spite of its size. And I also know it's made up of human beings that are broken and battered and in need of healing.
Okay, so I, I was actually going to do the men's peer groups plug, but I'll save it for because I think it's a very important point. Um, but before that, so what saves Israeli men from the caricature of machismo is that they're probably the most rounded um, type of person. You know, you very often see men dealing with responsibilities relating to childhood. You know, the dads are taking the kids to kindergarten and are doing the shopping, are doing all these things which, you know, are claimed by, I suppose, you know, modern tropes in feminism, but in reality have been a feature of the Jewish family, of the, you know, it's Judaism is often, I think, misrepresented as a very patriarchal religion. But ultimately, you know, men listen to their mothers, and there's a tremendous respect. I think it's a little bit divergent from the way Italian men listen to their mothers. Jewish men listen to their mothers, and it's actually a very matriarchal society. And the number one element of the matriarchy is the sanctity of life and the continuation of life. So, so all of the, you know, the kind of the rugged individualism, right, that characterizes America, the kind of the cowboy caricature. It features here, but it's tempered by
Mm.
this accountability to the moms. It's really the moms that led to the withdrawal from Lebanon by, you know, just having had enough at the amount of soldiers that were being lost. And here as well, you know, this huge push by the left, and really it was the moms of the hostages that, for better or for worse, led to a non-machismo. It hasn't been overstated in the media. But so I think that's one thing. The other thing, as I say, is that Israel is actually very peer-oriented. It's very set up for that. But as you say, when you're on home ground, it's very difficult to lower those defenses. It's something that men need, and you do it in the army, right? There's, you know, 19-year-olds are telling 18-year-olds what to do, but 18-year-olds are challenging the 23-year-olds who are their captains and their majors and are encouraged to do that. So there is there's a peer characteristic to that it's very difficult to overcome the boundaries, the barriers that title and machismo create. But I think that there's a huge benefit to be derived from being able to scale and to teach and to pass on. In fact, I'd even say further is that it's not that much of a stretch to think of an Israeli army as kind of a men's peer group. As you say, it's probably got the least emphasized difference in terms of behavior according to military rank. It's there because without the hierarchy, it couldn't function, but it's often open to being challenged. And I think that, majors, I'll tell you something that's really interesting, Dafka, about Israeli war strategy is it's always the colonel, the captain or the officer who leads the charge into battle, which is the exact opposite of the way it's seen militarily to be prudent to do, which is the captain or officer is at the back and the young guys go first. And that's why, so many of these guys who died were captains, because they would lead their troops. And it was a great honor because you're the same as your guys. It's nothing to suggest that you're more valuable than the guy who's coming up behind you.
By the way, that's the name of our book, Acharai, after me. That's what they're notoriously heard saying, right? Leading the
Right.
charge as the leader. And so I don't know, like we're writing this book, dude. We're writing this book.
All right. I'm in. Let's see how we go.
But let's just continue or wrap this up with this idea, because like I just led a men's peer group for a bunch of Israelis, some Americans as well, but a lot of Israelis here in Colorado. And on the one hand, yes, it was very organic to them to gather around a table, to talk, to drop the bullshit. Israelis are pretty good at being transparent, sometimes too transparent. And but here's where it started to break down. Because in men's peer groups, it's gestalt. We don't tell each other what to do. I can't know what you need to do. That's very hard for an Israeli to not interject and say you should, right? Israelis shit all over everything. Should. And these guys were doing it, and we would stop them and say, look, it's not you should, it's in my experience. This worked for me. There was a softening and a vulnerability that comes with saying, I don't know. Right? I'm going to share with you my experience, and I'm here to listen to your experience. And I guess that comes full circle because that's what you've provided for me in my life.
Cool.
And I think that every man, especially women too, but women find this. Men need this space. I wouldn't call it safe space. I call it brave space to just say the hard things, hear the hard things, and to have somebody just to bear witness, to listen to their journey.
Yeah. Typically men don't do well with intimacy, and the fact that they don't do well with it doesn't mean that they don't desperately need it. If you talk about bulwarks against suicidality, so we were speaking about how vulnerability really helps. The ultimate aim of vulnerability is the connection that stems from intimacy, and the best way to prevent somebody from harming themselves is to offer them a sense of connection for two reasons. One is they feel heard and seen, but now they also feel like, there's this notion of I'm a burden to everybody else. It wouldn't make a difference if I wasn't here. Second, you have that, you're clearing a path to eliminating yourself. But when somebody cares about you and you understand that their life would be infinitely impoverished by your absence, so it keeps you there, keeps you grounded. And having a peer relationship, which invites vulnerability, intimacy, and connection, is possibly the most important tool to safeguard against the dark thoughts and where they can take us. So which is to say that it's a very important, necessary, powerful tool that needs to be honed and developed.
So I'm converting men's peer groups into a nonprofit here in America for many reasons, not the least of which is I want to be able to scale this and make it available to anybody regardless of cost. And one of the things I've been thinking about is, once we're ready to raise money from people listening to this podcast or elsewhere who say, wow, this is a really important thing in men's lives in general, but in warriors returning home from the military, veterans here in America, and also veterans in Israel, and to provide them a safe landing place to continue the best of what the Army offered them, that chevra, that camaraderie, that connection and community, but then to replace the battle component with the inner battle, the external battle with the inner battle that every man is going to continue to do, and to have a safe and brave space for him to do it, and to get somebody to underwrite it so that we can bring it to warriors returning home from Gaza and have this waiting for them. That's a dream I have of mine, and I'm sure something that resonates with you.
I would just end off by saying one more thing, which is another thing that a peer group encourages is to ask the important, the simple, the direct questions, which is something as simple as I notice you're a little bit withdrawn. Are you okay? How are you sleeping lately? Or even have you had any thoughts about harming yourself lately? These seem to be such treacherous areas, such treacherous questions, but they're so important because they create a basis for connection. And truthfully, without asking those simple questions, there's no way to know what's going on for people. And if the playing fields are not leveled, it's incredibly difficult to ask somebody that's a superior if that's what's going on for them, because it feels so intrusive. But if you're on a peer level, again, you can in the simplest way possible address these things. So it's a great launch pad like that. And I know that we've been focusing on men, which is probably the demographic in the greatest need. But I think that this model with a few tweaks, you can copy paste to other population groups as well, where like teenagers, for example, or any of the classic demographics where suicidality is a real threat. But obviously, we need to crawl before we can walk, and this is a great
Yochai,
start.
you're killing me here. I started out by saying, I'm the macro, you help me get connected to the micro. I'm trying to focus on one thing, and now you're taking me out to the world. Yes, we're going to get there. We're going to repair the world, and we're going to do it one peer group at a time. So,
Amen,
um,
amen. Please, God,
I,
we
I
should
just,
have
I,
strength,
I
strength.
love, I love everything that you've shared with us today. This is the first of many, not the only podcast. We're gonna write a book together on this. Acharai, after me, the six most valuable insights the the people of Israel have to offer the world to stay alive. We got to come up with a better title, and so we're gonna start working on that. And we're gonna bring men's peer groups to Israel, and we got a lot of big work ahead of us.
You
But I
see, this
still
is
need you
why
to keep me
you're the
grounded.
visionary. I could never conceive of all these things, but I'm going to grab
But
onto your coattails.
keep us grounded, keep it real, and you have provided such a unique and invaluable role in my life, and I love you for it. I love you, and thank you.
Amen, amen. Very, very honored and much appreciated. And
All
let's
right,
just
brother.
go from
Well,
strength to strength.
again, the first of many. Normally I'd say the blessing, the shehechianu, because you say that the first time that you're doing something, and so, but you get the sentiment. I really appreciate you, and I look forward to more. Thanks, brother.
All right. Okay. God bless. Thanks for having me on, and we'll speak.